Welcome everyone to Weekend Escapades. Robert here, and there's a saying in the Old West that whiskey's for drinking and water is for fighting over. Today we are headed to Las Vegas, but we'll be going back in time to the early beginnings before it became the Las Vegas that we know today. Come along and join the adventure. This area has been used by humans for over 15,000 years. The first people to live in Las Vegas were the Native Americans, the Southern Paiute. They settled here around 300 CE. Now they would live in the mountains nearby in the summer to stay cool and come into Las Vegas in the winter area to be next to the spring. Now it was in 1829 when a band of New Mexican traders en route to Los Angeles came upon this area. The lush valley contained freshwater springs and was described in their native Spanish as Las Vegas, the meaning the meadow. Now, the Vegas remained largely unknown to the general public until 1844, when explorer John C. Fremont made note in his travel log of camping at the spring with his expedition party. Now, the first white settlers were Mormon, sent here by Brigham Young in 1855. And they built a fort, and this fort was made of adobe bricks, and when completed consisted of 4 walls 150 feet long, and a row of 2-story interior buildings. Parts of the original eastern walls and the southeast portions of the 2-story buildings still remain. So these are the walls to the old fort that originated here. Of course, the old fort was built originally by Mormon settlers that Brigham Young had sent out here. I believe it was 35 individuals to come settle, but it didn't last long because they couldn't grow crops. It was extremely hot. Started getting a little bit testy with each other, so they called off that mission and sent them back to Salt Lake. See, the walls were built with kind of gun ports up here as well. Head up on the wall. Walkway all the way around, so it's elevated positions if you had to protect the fort. These are only a few walls, a couple walls, pieces of that are still left, and a gate right over here would have been the entrance to the fort. So what they did is they remade this to look like the Mormon fort, because that old wall, some of the photos or that guard post wouldn't have been there, so they rebuilt that. But this is where the wall would have been and what it would have looked like when you rode up after a long hot ride in the desert on your wagons to come rest here in this old outpost. Funny thing is, this is right in the middle of Las Vegas, very close to Fremont Street. So even though this is an old Mormon fort and an old outpost for the Old West with a low population back then, this is where it all started in Vegas. Literally right here, because of a spring, there's just activity everywhere, and the Circa is right over there in the distance, and that is going to be Las Vegas Boulevard not far from here. Unreal to think that this is where it started. It was like a little oasis in the desert. This is like the only pioneer piece of Las Vegas left. So the first thing you see when you enter the grounds of the old fort is, of course, the full statue of Helen Jane Weiser Stewart, April 16th, 1854 to March 16th, 1926, considered the First Lady of Las Vegas. Now, Helen Weiser was born in Illinois in 1854. At 18, she married 38-year-old Archibald Stewart and moved with him to his ranch in Lincoln County, about 30 miles north of Pioche, Nevada. A social person living in remote Nevada was tough on Helen, and after the birth of their first child in 1874, she convinced Archibald to move into Pioche, which had a livable population of about 7,000 people. Helen loved being once more surrounded by friends and acquaintances, and the couple had 2 more children while living there. And in 1879, a fateful loan was made by Archibald that would change Helen's life forever. Octavius Gass was the owner of this location 640-acre ranch, Las Vegas Rancho. He borrowed $5,000, but he defaulted on his taxes, and in 1879, with poor weather because of the crops being destroyed, had no money to pay the loan, and it was foreclosed by Archibald. Archibald and Helen and their children moved into the ranch 180 miles south of Pioche, Nevada. A pregnant Helen then was upset about being on an isolated ranch. So Helen and Archibald now living in the old Mormon fort in a house built by Octavius Gass. But despite the harsh soil, there was water bubbling up on the land, and Helen was able to make a successful crop of fruit and vegetables to sell to local miners. So there's some trees here that look like they're some kind of fruit trees that may be original. Fruit here, they had a nice garden here. And I imagine throughout the years, some of these might be seedlings from some of the original plants that existed in this location. Now, as we come up here on this one, this is the only original part of the structure that remains. The corner, we're actually going to go in, and that is the real part. So it still exists on the inside. They've had to redo it and everything, but that is still original. So the actual spring was 3 miles up from here, kind of north. From this location up in Vegas, and that spring ran down from there almost like a river to this location. So this was a beautiful oasis in the desert. This now, of course, is not the real spring. There is no water that's coming out of that spring any longer, as we know that the Vegas area is literally a kind of a vast wasteland when it comes from water, and they get it from everywhere else but here. But at one time, a stick in the ground and water would come out of the ground. There was that much water. But in July of 1884, things took a tragic twist. Archibald was away from the ranch, and when a hired hand named Schuyler Henry suddenly quit and demanded Helen pay him for his work immediately. Helen refused, saying Archibald would have to deal with the issue when he returned. Henry grew more and more abusive, but Helen refused to pay him. Henry finally left, taking refuge at a nearby Kiel ranch, and we're going to hear more about that ranch at the end. Now, when Archibald returned home, he spoke to Helen, and he grew extremely angry about the situation and took off on his horse to settle the matter. Now, Helen wasn't sure where her husband had gone, and it wasn't long before a rider, a ranch hand from Conrad Kiel's ranch, delivered a note that said, "Mrs. Stewart, send a team and take Mr. Stewart away. He is dead. Signed, Conrad Kiel." Suddenly alone and pregnant with her 5th child, Helen, just 30 years old, soon discovered Archibald had left no will. She had to go to the court systems and fight for the ownership for the family home. Luckily, she eventually won the judgment and split the ranch between her and her children. Helen, discovering that she needed to make a living from this ranch, made it a destination for weary travelers with water, food, and breakfast. It was said that when she looked to the north, she could see the dust of arriving riders and would start the coffee and get it ready for those travelers. Now, it was very common to see Helen working at the ranch in a fancy dress and work boots because she had to grind out a living in this difficult desert community. And it wasn't long after that Helen acquired an additional 250 acres because of rumors circulating that the valley would be bought by the railroads, as water was needed for the old steam engines. It was in 1902 that Helen sold the ranch to the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. As the new town of Las Vegas began to grow and become settled with people, Helen J. Stewart finally was able to enjoy being a part of the social, political, and business life of the town, something she had sorely missed with the isolation of the ranch. Throughout Helen's life, she had become involved in all of the moving parts and development of Las Vegas, and this is why she is known as the First Lady of Las Vegas. This area we're looking into here is the original part of the fort and the home that we are looking at. We're literally standing in it now. This was the first flag flown over Las Vegas, July 4th, 1855. Original stone from the old fort, the wall and the small room at the end of the building. So the first building we just saw These are stones from that building and the walls of the fort.
Now, as I had mentioned earlier, we were going to head to the Kiel Ranch. This is 2.5 miles away north from the fort. This is the area where Archibald was shot in the head, and Helen had to come and pick him up to take him home. It is said that this is the desert and there is no wood available at the time, and Helen had to construct a casket out of a door from her home.
So this is the old location of the Kiel Ranch, built by John S. Park in 1911. The Park Mansion, or White House, was the main dwelling structure on the ranch for generations after Conrad Kiel, Kiel, and William Clark owned the property. The house was a single-story building with a wooden shiplap siding. Now this is one of the original buildings as well. There's not really a path going up here, but we'll dredge through here. They've got this fenced off because it's really falling down. But this is one of the original buildings over here on the Kiel Ranch. Just barely left standing. This is all really in the kind of the north Las Vegas area. So we're not very far away from the area, of course, the old Mormon fort where we were. But this is where the water from the spring would have came from that ran down to the Mormon fort. Now this house was constructed on railroad ties foundation in 1939, and what they called it was the dollhouse. You can see why. It's all white, tiny, little dollhouse. Okay, so they've got this closed, the fence, and you're not supposed to go in here. This would be the spring habitat area where the spring still comes out of the ground. You see they're doing some work here where the water actually ran. They've got a little cement piece there where the water runs out right there where it's all green with the reeds. Runs down here. You could tell the fort would have been over that way about 2.5 miles, and that water would run like it was a creek back in the day when it was really flowing. It supplied water to that oasis for the Mormon fort. You can see when you get a little bit of water where that spring would have ran right here. So when you get that extra spring runoff, right through this area.
Well, as we conclude on the story of Las Vegas and Helen Stewart and her husband Archibald, in realizing that this is Las Vegas now. You've seen what it once looked like, but look what it has become, and it really hasn't been that long.
Well, that's going to do it for today from the old Mormon fort, the old spring that started Las Vegas. And until our next adventure, goodbye from Weekend Escapades, and we'll see you in the next one.
Staggering to think that an old spring in the Mojave Desert turned into an old west town now has become one of the most popular destinations in the world.